Philistines kind of come to oppress them again. But one thing I wanted to cover from chapter 7 that we didn't get to last week, just really, really quickly, is this Ebenezer, this stone that they set up in chapter 7. In verse 12 of chapter 7, then Samuel took a stone, he sets it up between Mizpah and Jeshanah and names it Ebenezer. And then he gives kind of a description of why. He says, "For thus far the Lord has helped us," which is interesting. We sing this phrase, right, in the song, "O thou fount of every blessing," right? "Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come." What are we singing about when we sing about the Ebenezer, right? That's something I wonder about. And, maybe we think of Scrooge at Christmas time, the Christmas Carol. It's what pops into my mind. Maybe there's a connection there, I don't know. But in Samuel, he gives us sort of this explanation of the term that's kind of veiled to us since we don't speak Hebrew or anything like that. He says, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." Right, so that's our first clue. And this is one of these cases where maybe it would have been more helpful for the translators to just go ahead and give us what this term means rather than just kind of leave the terms in Hebrew as Ebenezer in the text, right? And just kind of represent the Hebrew with English letters. And it's made up of two words, actually, as these things often are. It's the word even, which means stone, right? And then ha'ezer, which means help or aid or ally, right? So it's stone of help, right? It means rock of aid or stone of help. And interestingly, just as another little factoid out there, when God creates Eve, right, when she's said to be a helper suitable for Adam, that's the same word. That's the exact same word that Eve is described as. And that word, ezer, I'll write it up here for us. That's what is in Hebrew, but that word is most often used of God, actually, right? And God is called Israel's aid or helper often in the Old Testament, right? But it's also the word that we see used of Eve for Adam, which is really interesting. So that's all for that little bit of chapter 7. I just think, the Ebenezer, we always sing about it, but what does that mean, So there you go. Now on to chapters 8 and 9. Someone I read kind of compared chapters 8 and 9 of 1 Samuel to the parable of the prodigal that Jesus gives, right? And of course it's about this foolish son who says, "Dad, I want my inheritance right now," right? Which is kind of like saying, "Hey, Dad, I wish you were dead," in their world. And the father does it, right? He goes ahead and he divides his inheritance. He gives the younger son his inheritance, and he goes away and he wastes it, and we know this parable. And one of the most shocking things about this parable is that the father does as the son requests, right? Why in the world would he say, yeah, right? Why would he not practice fatherly discretion and say, "No, well, maybe let's not be too hasty here, son," And we're sort of left to ponder that in the parable. And this is sort of like what we see in 1 Samuel chapter 8. What happens in 1 Samuel chapter 8? Kind of the main thing. The people come to Samuel and they ask for something. Give us a king. Right? They want a king. They want a kingdom, right? They want a monarchy. And this bothers Samuel. And it seems to bother God as well. But even though this isn't how it's supposed to be, if you will, I guess, God still says, go ahead and give them what they want, Samuel. Even though this isn't maybe the ideal, God still says to Samuel, give them a king. Give them what they ask for. Right? And we're kind of at this point wondering, why? Why would he do that? Why would he not say, if everything is going rather well in Israel's history right now. They've just defeated the Philistines. Why would he acquiesce to their request, right? Why would he give them that? And so we're going to ponder that this morning. We've kind of already tackled this first question here. What is the persistent, or well, maybe we haven't. What is the persistent problem that appears again in 8 verses 1 through 3? And it says, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. And the name of his firstborn son was Joel. The name of the second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not follow in their ways, but turned aside and did not follow in his ways, but turned aside after gain. And they took bribes, and they perverted justice, right? So what's the persistent problem here? Bad parenting. We see it again, right? It happened with Eli and his sons. Now Samuel's dropped the ball, it seems like. I will say, we don't get... this says his sons turned aside after gain, right? It doesn't mention any of the other things that Eli's sons did at the temple, which is interesting. But, yeah.
And the other thing is the tendency of people in the position of leadership using it for gain.
Yes.
Rather than just, So
yeah.
That's the other thing.
Yeah. And I think, it's easy to kind of look at the people's request at this point. Sorry, I need my flicker not pen. But it's easy to look at the people's request at this point and think, oh my goodness, they're so naive, right? They should have known to not ask for a king, or to sort of understand that as a mistake. But really, Samuel is the kind of sort of the on the ground leadership in Israel at this point. Him and his sons, and they're failing, right? Just like Eli's sons are failing. So in one sense, I can kind of understand why the people would be nervous, right? They've seen this story play out before, right, with Eli's sons. And so maybe, from their point, it does a little bit make sense to ask for new leadership, right? Which isn't to say there isn't any naivety in the request at all, because I think we do see that a little bit more later. But I just want to throw that out there, that maybe you can kind of get where they're coming from a little bit. They've seen this story happen before.
And also with this persistent problem, it's often very true that, and a new generation rose up who did not know God, right? So we have this success-failure cycle throughout the Old Testament process.
Yeah, it kind of looks like the cycle of the judges is threatening to happen again, right? Samuel's the last judge, and it looks like maybe that's starting to spiral again.
Yeah, that was not correct.
Yeah.
Generation. We don't see this in Samuel. Samuel's faithful servant.
Yeah.
He may have been before.
Right.
In some aspects. But it wasn't his example.
Yeah.
And so every generation has to choose. They don't get their faith from us.
Yeah.
Personally. They have to develop.
Yeah, that's a good point. Something's been lost in translation here, right? And Samuel's sons should have learned from their father, but for some reason they've turned aside after gain. So, yeah, that's a good point. All right, our second question. Maybe we've kind of covered this already, but what drives the people to ask for a king in chapter 8, verse 5?
They want to be like other nations.
Yeah, they want to be like other nations.
And the corruption of Samuel's sons.
Yep, and as we said, the corruption of Samuel's sons. I think there's a sort of a big temptation here to make security an idol, right? They want what they think is going to give them absolute security, right? Having a legitimate kingdom and a king like everyone else, and all of these things they think are going to give them absolute security. Which is ironic because they had God as their king, right? They had security absolutely already. So it's kind of ironic that they would ask for that, but they do. And then we can kind of talk about this one a little bit more. What's the appeal of the kings like the nations besides some of the things we've already said?
But he would judge them like he would judge them. He would rule over them.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Security.
pride, reputation, power.
Yeah. Israel isn't a large nation at this point, right? They're still relatively small. And so pride could be a big part of it as well, right? They want a legitimate monarchy, like everybody else.
And perhaps someone who can go out and conquer territories and expand the reach of the nation.
Right. Which all of these things that we're naming, these are really good, but I think at this point, we know what's coming as people who've read 1 Samuel before. Is he gonna do any of that for them? Not really, isn't he? Maybe some things, he does some good things, and he wins a couple battles, and he starts out strong. But we're going to see in chapter 9 some interesting things that already kind of fly in the face of what the people are asking for. So, just to keep that in mind as we go forward. But from some of my notes here, a lot of time has passed. Samuel is now old, and he's made his sons judges over Israel. And their sin is taking bribes, right? Perverting justice. Which, of course, violates the Pentateuch, their law, right? You could go to Exodus 23, Deuteronomy 16, right? The prophets also warn about this kind of thing, taking bribes and perverting justice, right? Isaiah 5 and Amos 5 and all of that. But Samuel's sons have kind of, their failure is pretty large, I would say, right? I think part of Israel's foundational commitment is to be a place where justice is practiced for all, right? As God loved these people are supposed to love one another, right? Their neighbor, and practice justice towards them and fairness toward them. And they're already failing to do that. So that's one of Israel's core commitments, and these priests are failing at that. So while we can agree that kingship maybe isn't the right choice here, we can kind of sympathize with the people, as we've said, because the conduct of Samuel's sons is not good at this point. And then, what's really interesting is when the people come and they ask for a king, God says, give them a king. Right? Go ahead and give them a king. And he notes two things. First, he says, this problem is a problem between me and them, right? Me and the people as God, right? Not Samuel and the people. This isn't a rejection of you, Samuel, even though it really probably does feel like it. This is a rejection of me, right? As their God. And then two, right? This, I think we shouldn't be surprised, right? This is something that the people have done before, right? In Judges, the people constantly sort of revert back to sin, and then they cry out to God, and God saves them, and then the cycle just goes down from there, right? It's a terrible spiral. Yeah, again, generational. And so God doesn't necessarily endorse this monarchy, but he also doesn't give them a hard no, like I'm not going to do this for you, which is really, really interesting. And then there's some, like we've already said, there's maybe some good reasons for thinking that a king would be a good solution for the nation at this point. Remember, Judges explicitly, this is one of the problems. There's no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Right? And I think part of the bigger problem is that even after Samuel gives them this warning, they respond in verse 19. he gives a long speech about what the kings are going to do and how they're going to abuse their own people. And then in verse 19 they say, "No, we are determined to have a king over us, so that we may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." Right? So I think the bigger problem is in their stubbornness, their determination to still press ahead with that. And then, of course, after this big victory in chapter 7, I think it's really odd that the people they don't come to Samuel and ask, what's next, or where do we go from here, right? They come up with a solution to the problem on their own. We hear about Samuel's sons and how they're corrupt, just like Eli's sons were. And they come to Samuel not with let's see how we can figure this out mentality, but hey, we have the solution, we want you to do this mentality. We think a king is going to solve it. They don't seek God for direction, but they've already got that answer that they think is going to work, right? And clearly they think it's new management.
It's interesting, you just mentioned that verse 20, that the two properties that they're looking for in the king, one who will judge us righteously, and one who will go out and fight our battles. And I wonder if the people had come to that understanding of what a king should be, because we have a king, Jesus, who fights our battles for us, and who will judge us. He intercedes for us as well, thank you.
Yeah.
But the idea, the concept of what a king should be, I don't know if they're laying a precedence here. And now we're going to see Saul fail, and we'll see King David, and he has a heart. And understanding that he has a heart, Jesus is going to have a heart as well.
Yeah.
That's setting some sort of long-term precedence for us to understand what a king should be and what a king does for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great point, because we get the first king who's not so great. He maybe starts out looking pretty great, but then he fails. King David is mostly great, but he has moments of weakness. And Solomon is good for the most part, but then he also has moments of weakness. And Scripture kind of functions as like a mirror at this point, I think. And it wants to put before you all of these flawed people who don't get it right, and they fail constantly. And even the best of them have terrible moments, right? So that when we get to Jesus, we see what kingship really should have been, right? And it's not like this kingship at all. It's not a warring kingship. It's not anything like that. And it's a sacrificial kingship. He even dies on our behalf. So I love that point.
When we see the judges, we don't see a succession of family kingship. Judges kind of bounce all around.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're being introduced to King David's kingship. It's going to last through all this time to bring about Jesus, because Jesus will be born through the lineage. And I don't know. It seems that the people have figured out judges aren't necessarily that answer.
Yeah.
Maybe what do we try about a king? And I think now God's going to teach us
Right.
the importance of loyalty in a king and justice and those things that we should all desire, and we have now
Yeah.
through Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. He specifically says, or he doesn't seem to love the idea of kingship, but they do learn through this. God gives them the kingship anyway, so I think that's important.
I was thinking this is a bit like the tendency of people to seek someone to whom they can delegate their own personal responsibilities.
Mm.
So it might be people for a king, it might be the members of the congregation to their preacher or their elders. It's kind of putting someone else into the position of accountability and
Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe that is an issue as well. The people are they're probably tired at this point of dealing with the Philistines without an official government. So yeah, that's probably part of it too.
It impresses me, but it also disappoints me about the elders, because the elders should have, along with Samuel, should have realized, hey, we do have a king. We have God that rules over us. We don't need a man-made government. We have a government. We have an eternal government. And it just disappoints me that the elders didn't realize that.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk more about this later, as I have some notes on this. But the people, the word has come up already. They're really naive. It seems like they ask for this thing, but I don't know that they fully get what they're asking for totally. And there's a sense that they've sort of traded something in for something counterfeit, if you will. Again, we'll maybe talk a little bit more about that, but I feel like you're right. There's definitely a sense in where even the elders don't fully realize what's going on, what they're doing. Just like some of the people who put Jesus to death, right? Even Jesus said, forgive them, they know not what they do. So yeah, that's a good point. All right, next set of questions. What is the future of those who ask for a king in verses 17 and 18? Specifically, verse 17. He'll take 1/10 of your flocks, and that's pretty bad. But there's a big and that comes after that.
You shall be his slave.
You shall be his slaves. Right? That should definitely set off some warning signs for us, right? What did the people of Israel, if we zoom out to the bigger picture, what have the people of Israel just come out of?
It's like every man was doing what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah, every man was doing what was right in his own eyes, but also slavery, right, in Egypt.
400 years.
Yeah, 400 years. They had just lived this life, right? But also, every man did what was right in his own eyes. That's a slavery of a different type. Everyone's doing what they think is good. Slavery to their own desires. But yeah, they've just come out of slavery, and there's kind of a sense where maybe God and Samuel want to communicate to the people, even though we're giving you this king, does it matter whether it's an Israelite king or whether it's a Pharaoh who's oppressing you? Both aren't really great, But we do, kingship in Israel does kind of go up from here. So maybe we're starting on a negative note.
And I know you were focused on 17, but 18, no relief from God when things get really bad. So don't want to hear you. And so that's going to be history. So I think that's huge.
Yeah. The relationship is different now. Yeah. Which is really interesting. It's almost like Israel is growing up a little bit. I don't have kids, but from the other side of it, there's a sense in which as you grow older, your relationship with your parents change, right? Caleb, and then we'll move to you. You didn't have anything? Okay, sorry, my bad.
So we see that when Israel came out of Egypt, it wasn't very long before they said, it'd be better if we just went back because we don't want to have to provide for ourselves. And then they say, well, we want a king that'll judge us and fight our battles for us. We don't want to do this anymore. We want somebody else to do this for us. And so
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that they're going back into slavery, and when they came out of slavery, they thought, it'd be better if we just went back to Egypt.
That's a really great point. To your point, what does Saul do? We won't cover this today, but in chapter 10, when Samuel sort of wants to present Saul to the people as the God's pick of their first king, what does Saul do? He hides. And I got to be honest, I think I would have too, right? Because of what you said, how much pressure is on him, as the first king, right? Who's supposed to do all of those things for Israel, and it's just immense pressure. And I think I'm a little bit sympathetic to Saul at this point. Just so much is on him. But yeah, okay. So what might we learn about the people, or what might we learn about God from his decision to let the people have a king, right? This kind of goes back to why would the father in the story of the prodigal son give his son something that may not be good for him?
Learning experience, maybe?
Yeah, yeah. It definitely is a learning experience.
It's one of those words that I told my kids they couldn't use, but sometimes he gives us what we deserve when we are stupid.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an excellent point, yeah.
It goes back to Kyle's point that ultimately God's people are going to get a king.
Mm-hmm.
They had a king that they did not appreciate.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be these development, the development of the nation, and then decline, development and decline,
Yeah.
then fall and captivity, all those things. But ultimately, in Samuel, we get a glimpse of figures that are like Christ
Yes.
in their heart. David was a man after God's own heart.
Yeah.
And so we get these figures that are Christ-like before Christ. But it's all pointing to Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. There are moments, we don't have just like a one-sided account of like David did everything right all the time, right? Or Saul did everything wrong all the time, right? We have pictures of success and failures for all of the kings, except for maybe Manasseh. He was pretty bad. But yeah, there are moments where David's actions really do look very Christ-like, and that's encouraging. Do we have a question over here? Okay, Caleb, and then we'll...
When we read about the kings of Judah, they're always measured according to their father David. They did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father David.
Yeah.
Or he did not do what was right according to all that his father David had done. So David was the standard of the kings of Judah.
Yeah, he is the standard. Yeah, and then we'll go to you.
I think we learn that God is a God of free will. I think it demonstrates that God is not going to force himself on people. I think he's going to allow people to choose and to suffer the consequences if need be.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was kind of going overall with this question, is he gives the people what he wants. He's not going to force them to be his little robot nation, which I think is really profound, that he gives them the freedom to do that.
Just to continue with that thought, God is weaving his plan through man's decision
Right.
in order to bring about salvation for mankind.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. God sort of goes on this journey with his people. Even though he realizes maybe this isn't the best choice for them, he's still with them through the whole process. And he's not absent. Right? So that's a great point. And then we've maybe already talked about this. What do the people expect their king to do for them in chapter 8, verse 20? It says they want a king like other nations so that he may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. So I see maybe two things here: official government, right? And then someone who's going to do their work for them, who's going to fight their battles. Which isn't maybe totally a bad thing, right? Someone to organize them and lead them isn't terrible, but it could be problematic, as we've said as well. So those are kind of the two big things. Let's see. Yeah, we've already talked about this, but the people of Israel, even the elders, are a little bit childlike at this point, right? Maybe they don't completely get what they're asking. The word, what's interesting in Samuel's speech here, in verses 10 and following, the word take is used repeatedly throughout this section. The king is going to be someone who takes, right? We don't see the word give very often here of something that the king does. And this, it kind of reminds me of the story of Adam and Eve, right? They don't really seem to grasp what their decision is going to entail. God tells them, don't eat from the tree, and we don't get a response from them. But eventually Eve decides that maybe the serpent is right, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so this is kind of reminds me a little bit of that, what Israel is doing here. Kingship maybe isn't the best route, but they reach out for that anyway. And then, monarchy is kind of the opposite of the Exodus. We've already touched on this again a little bit, but chapter 8, verse 17 says they will be slaves, right, which they were already in Egypt. And that's surely meant to echo the fact that they were slaves in Egypt. Kingship implies also kind of the divvying up of society, if you will, right? Once a king comes along, he's going to need courtiers, people to support him. He's going to need an army. He's going to need all of this stuff, right, that kings use and that kings need. And he's going to have to pay those people. And how's he going to pay them? He's going to give that land that he took from the Israelites and give it to his top people, so they'll keep fighting, so they'll have loyalty to him, right? And that's just kind of how these things work. And so you have this power base around the king is going to grow, and then all the rest of Israel suffers. Let's see what else. So yeah, that's most of what I wanted to say about chapter 8. And then again, going back to God, He creates, but He doesn't necessarily control, right? He creates human beings, but He doesn't make them thoughtless robots, right? He gives us the opportunity to choose Him, which is amazing. And He does the same thing here. And He chooses to kind of enter this struggle with us, to go along with us in our foolish decisions sometimes, right? Which is really comforting. God doesn't just get up and abandon Israel after this foolish decision. We see that the relationship is probably going to change. It's probably not going to be like it was before, 100%. But He does stick with them. So that can be comforting for us. All right, chapter 9. First thing I want to ask, this is kind of obvious, but there's so much in this. What are we told about Saul? What's his primary characteristic?
And tall.
He's tall, and he's a good-looking dude. Yeah, and that's important. I once had a teacher, a teacher at Florida College. He was a Bible teacher. And he always used to say, whenever someone is described as handsome in the Bible, your warning light should be going off. You should be thinking, uh-oh. And for the most part, he's right, And this is exactly one of those cases, right? We should be hearing an uh-oh, a warning sign, something. Later, we're going to see David described as ruddy, right? Which isn't maybe exactly the same thing, but still, it's kind of a handsome young guy. Later, David's son is going to talk specifically about his hair, right? He's got really long, beautiful hair, and that's going to be his downfall. But yeah, so this should be a warning to us. We'll maybe say a little bit more about that in a second. And then, they get into this, we're introduced to Saul, and he's got this problem. His father's donkeys have ran off, and him and his servant are looking for him. And there comes a point where Saul wants to say, okay, let's give up on the donkeys. They're just donkeys, probably his dad has more than just a few donkeys. So let's go back because Dad's going to start worrying about me rather than the donkeys. And so this is where this question comes from. Who is kind of more persistent in this story? It's between Saul and his servant. Yeah. Yeah, Saul seems to find every excuse to not figure out a solution to this problem, right? He's like, well, let's go home. Let's just forget about the donkeys. And the servant is like, well, no, there's this guy. There's the seer Samuel. Let's go up to Samuel. He'll tell us our way. And then Saul's like, but we don't have anything to give him. Like, what are we going to pay him with? And he's like, I have some payment we could give him. So we see this a lot. He doesn't really seem to want to actually figure out a solution to the problem here. But eventually, he does go, right? The servant convinces Saul, and they do go. And then finally, where does Saul find out about Samuel's whereabouts? This is kind of interesting. The women that were coming out of the city. Where do the women go to, though? Where does he find these women? To draw water, right? So a well. And that's kind of an interesting theme that we see in other places in the Bible as well, right? Wells are a common thing we see. Where does Isaac send his servant to find his wife? A well. Where does Jacob meet Rachel? A well, right? Where does Moses meet Zipporah? A well, right? So if you want to meet women, you need to go to a well. That's not my joke. Again, another professor at Florida College would often say, we should call the local campus drink place, food, the cafeteria, they should call it the well, because that's where you go to meet women in the Bible. But anyway, it's kind of interesting, right? He meets these women at the well, but he doesn't find a wife. He is actually told about Samuel, right? So our expectations are kind of maybe pulled out from under us there. But yeah, he goes on to meet Samuel and finds out that he's going to be king. And so that's an interesting part of the story here. I want to go back to Saul is handsome, right? That's kind of a warning for us. Also, more specifically, right, what did we learn from Hannah's song back in chapter 2? God humbles the proud, but he exalts the humble, right? So this reversal theme. She even says in chapter 2, verse 3, speak no more of stature, right? And Saul is described as a man of stature. So this, again, this should be a warning to us. Saul is someone who looks really good. He looks like he could play the part of kingship, but we're going to find out that once he becomes prideful, he will be humble, just like Hannah said. And then back to Saul and the story of the donkeys. We've already said that he kind of doesn't want to seem to find a solution to this. Saul, he looks an awful lot like the judges in many ways. He seems to lack confidence at this stage in his life, as we see kind of from the chapter 9 here, but also in chapter 10. Like we said, he's going to hide among the baggage, that sort of stuff. And he's someone who kind of, I guess one of the best ways I could describe it, he's someone who reaches for things, but he never quite gets there, right? He's so close to being, I think, a good king, right? And he was very close to that at certain points in his career. He and David are going to have a falling out, but there's going to be these moments where David confronts Saul, and he says, David, is that you, my son? Right? And it almost melts your heart, right? He's almost there, but just not quite. Which I'm sure there's a lesson in there for us somewhere. But that's how I would describe Saul. And then, what phrase do we see repeated in chapter 9, verses 15 and 16? I'll read it for us here. It says, Saul came to Samuel, tomorrow about this time I will send to you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be ruler over my people, Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have seen the suffering of my people. And this is when God is talking to Samuel about Saul, and it's all about the people, right? From God's perspective, he doesn't anoint Saul for the sake of the monarchy. He doesn't anoint Saul for the sake of establishing this new kind of institution in Israel, right? He doesn't do it even for the sake of Saul and Saul's family. Saul is a solution to his people's problem. And that's what we see God care about, I think, here. All right. We'll move to the last half of chapter 9 now, unless anyone has comments. We see people coming out.
There was a sense in which
Yeah.
later on God speaks about Saul's mistake in sacrificing. That God would establish his kingdom forever. So there is some sense in which God had purpose for Saul himself and his lineage.
Yeah, that's a good point too. It can be kind of tempting to view Saul as kind of a throwaway first start type of deal, and he's not exactly that either, right? So that's important, yeah. We are pretty much at time, so we had a couple more questions that might have been good to look at, but we'll go ahead and call it for this week. Next week we'll do, of course, chapters 10 and 11. As always, thank you guys so much for your questions, your comments. You guys are always a talkative group, and that's helpful. So thank you.